Hello, and welcome to today's episode of our podcast. I'm Hallie.
And I'm Ayana.
And I'm Johanna. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're diving into a critical and often overlooked topic, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW.
This issue is devastating. Communities across North America with Indigenous women facing violence at rates far higher than the national average. Thousands of cases remain unsolved, and yet it feels like no one is paying attention.
That's right. The numbers are staggering, but they don't even tell the full story. Many cases go unreported or misclassified. It's an epidemic rooted in a long history of colonization and systemic neglect.
Today, we'll explore how this crisis came to be, hear some stories, and listen to some experts and discuss how we can all contribute to solutions.
So let's get started by listening to some of the experts who've dedicated their lives to addressing this crisis.
Indigenous communities are often located in remote areas, making it harder to report crimes or access resources.
Take Montana, for example. The state has one of the highest rates of missing Indigenous women. The combination of rural settings and limited law enforcement presence creates a perfect storm for cases to go unresolved.
There's also the issue of man camps, temporary housing for oil and gas workers near reservations. These camps have been linked to increased rates of violence against Indigenous women.
This geographical isolation also highlights the power imbalance between Indigenous communities and the U.S. government. Historically, the government has failed to protect Indigenous people, often prioritizing resource extraction over safety.
It's a harsh reality, but understanding the geographical and systemic factors helps us see the bigger picture. Next, let's look at how culture and history ties into this crisis. So, how big is this issue? Indigenous women experience violence at alarmingly high rates. Over 4 in 5 Indigenous women will face violence in their lifetime, and the murder rate is 10 times higher than the national average.
And thousands of women have disappeared or been murdered over the past few decades. In Canada alone, over 1,200 cases of MMIW were documented in a government inquiry, but activists say the real number is much higher.
And let's talk about underreporting. Many cases go unreported or misclassified. Sometimes, Indigenous women are often misidentified as belonging to other racial groups, which skews the data.
To put a face to numbers, let's discuss some real-life stories. One well-known case is that of Hannah Harris, a young mother who went missing in 2013. Her body was found days later, but her case only gained attention because of community protests.
Single mother Hannah Harris was a member of the Northern Cheyenne Nation in Montana, and she was only 21 years old when she disappeared on July 4th, 2013. Hannah's remains were found beaten so badly that an official cause of death has never been determined. The Harris family's demands for justice following her disappearance and murder finally led the way for the first Senate resolution declaring May 5th as National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Two-Spirit folks, and girls. Hannah's story is only one of thousands of similar cases. In the U.S., Native American women are more than twice as likely to experience violence than any other demographic. In Canada, the homicide rates for Indigenous women are nearly 6 times as high as for other women. And these crimes are overwhelmingly committed by individuals outside of Native communities. This May 5th, wear red to show your support of MMIW, but more than that, donate to your local Center for Indigenous Women and tell your policymakers at the tribal, state, local, and international levels around the world that Indigenous women deserve to be protected. Families of these stolen sisters have been pleading for decades to bring attention to this crisis. And you can help demand change and drive the meaningful legislation needed that will remove the barriers to safety for our vulnerable relatives. I call on you, community, kin, and allies to do your part and take action to help prevent violence against Indigenous women, Two-Spirit folks, and girls. This can no longer be ignored by those who are in positions of power. Together we can change the narrative and demand justice, demand a world where our women are considered sacred and our safety is upheld.
Another tragic story is Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, who was murdered in 2017 while she was 8 months pregnant. Her case led to the passage of Savannah's Act, which aims to improve the reporting and investigation of MMIW cases.
Savannah had been the victim of a gruesome, homicide. Two female kayakers were out on the Red River when they spotted something. Tangled around a log was an object wrapped in trash bags and duct tape, and the two women immediately called local police. The object was fished out of the rapids, and it was a body made nearly unidentifiable from the raging waters. But after spotting two small tattoos on the deceased's ankle and thigh, there was no denying it. They had found Savannah. During her autopsy, the pathologist discovered she had a rope tied around her neck, and worst of all, along her abdomen were a series of horizontal incisions suggesting that Savannah had endured a crude C-section.
Gosh, that's evil.
So on August 28th, Brooke and William were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and giving false information to police. And while Brooke maintained that Savannah had offered up her baby to her, William had a different take on how the events unfolded. He says on that Saturday, August 19th, he came home from work at around 2:30 p.m. to hear an odd sound coming from the bathroom. It was the cries of a newborn wrapped in a blanket in the tub, which Brooke showed him proudly while saying, "This is our baby, this is our family." Meanwhile, lying next to the tub was the body of Savannah bleeding out onto the floor. Over time, Brooke admitted to a similar version of events, admitting yes, she was the one who performed the botched C-section in order to give William the child that he was demanding from her, but she took it a step further, saying it was William's idea to grab a rope and strangle Savannah, after which he said if she wasn't dead before, she is now. Brooke then said they kept Savannah in a bathroom closet while the police searched the apartment. So 2 days later, on August 21st, they then placed Savannah in a hollowed-out dresser to get her out of the building unnoticed. Eventually, Brooke pleaded guilty to all three of the charges brought against her, and in January 2018, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. William pled not guilty, so he went to trial, and they ended up finding him not guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. However, the judge didn't go lightly on William. He still gave him life in prison with the possibility of parole for the other two charges, conspiracy to commit kidnapping and lying to police. On September 12th, 2017, a judge finally awarded Ashton custody of their little girl, which was a big win in a long, heartbreaking war. As of this recording, she is a little over 6 years old. It's only a matter of time before Hazley Joe fully understands, though, that her mother's tragic death is bringing the world one step closer to the equality that we deserve. And that is the case of Savannah Greywind.
These are just two stories among thousands. Each case represents a life cut short and a family to seek justice on their own.
What can we do to help? First, educate yourself. Learn about the issue and share what you know with others. Awareness is the first step to change.
Second, support Indigenous-led organizations. These groups are on the front lines of the fight for justice. Donating your time and money can make a big difference.
And third, advocate for change. Contact your local representatives and demand stronger protections for Indigenous women. Push for better funding for investigations and support services.
Lastly, participate in events like MMIW awareness walks or vigils. These gatherings not only honor the lives lost, but also send a message that these women are not forgotten.
The MMIW crisis isn't just a modern issue, but is deeply tied to historical and cultural context. For example, the era share of Indigenous voices began with policies like the Indian Removal Act and continued through residential schools.
These schools were designed to strip Indigenous children of their culture and identity. Generations grew up disconnected from their roots, creating cycles of trauma that persist today.
Even in literature and media, Indigenous women are often portrayed as invisible or disposable. These harmful stereotypes contribute to the lack of urgency in addressing their disappearances.
But Indigenous communities are reclaiming their narratives. Movements like the Red Dress Project and art by Indigenous creators remind us of the humanity behind statistics.
These cultural efforts are a powerful form of resistance and a way to honor the lives that have been lost. Now, let's reflect on what we've learned and why this matters.
These stories and learning about the systemic issues behind MMIW has been eye-opening for me. It's hard to imagine how these families must feel, losing a loved one and having to fight for justice on their own.
For me, the most striking part is how normalized this has become. Indigenous women and their communities deserve so much better. The lack of action from authorities is unacceptable.
I agree, but I'm also inspired by the resilience of Indigenous communities. Their activism and determination to reclaim their stories gives me hope for change.
So why should we care about the MMIW crisis? For one, it's a human rights issue. These women are mothers, daughters, and sisters. Their lives matter.
It's also about accountability. As a society, we have a responsibility to demand justice and stand with Indigenous communities.
And there's something each of us can do, whether it's educating yourself, supporting Indigenous-led organizations, or advocating for policy changes. Every effort helps.
Let's not see these voices be silenced. Let's not see these voices be silenced. Together, we can create a world where Indigenous women are protected and valued.
Thanks for listening. We hope this episode has inspired you to learn more and take action.
Until next time, stay informed and keep the conversation going.